In America, you consume my videos. In Soviet Russia, my videos consume you! Now, because I am not nearly famous enough to make a living off of YouTube alone, yet, recently I went out and got a full-time job at a fast food place. So far, I have taken two things away from this job. First, I finally understand how Squidward feels, and second, because most of what I've been tasked to do at this job is prepare drinks for our customers, I am now something of an expert on soda, or pop as my extremely Midwestern mom calls it. And filling so many cups with Coca-Cola, Diet Coke, Sprite, Dr. Pepper, and my favorite kind of soda, root beer, has got me thinking about the video game character most strongly associated with soft drinks, Soda Popinski from Punch-Out! Ever since I first watched the Game Grumps playthroughs of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and Punch-Out Wii when I was 13, I've been a big fan of the Punch-Out series. At first, I was drawn to it because I thought some of the boxers were attractive, especially Piston Hondo, who I was so enamored with that I would draw little pictures of us together and write things like Mrs. Hondo in the margins of my school notebooks when I was in middle school, and who I still have something of a crush on. But when I played the game for myself, I was delighted by its gameplay and found each member of its colorful cast to be fun and charming, even the ugly ones. I even made fan kids for some of the Punch-Out boxers. While he's not my favorite Punch-Out boxer, that title goes to the aforementioned Piston Hondo, Soda Popinski is pretty high on my faves list. He just fascinates me for some reason, and he always has for as long as I've known about his existence. In fact, he caused me to develop an interest in Russian culture and history, though to be fair, Mega Man 4, the fact that I took ballet classes at the time, and my interests in astronomy and chemistry, both of which Russia has made significant contributions to, gave me a bit of a head start there. In honor of that, my outfit today is inspired by something from Russian history that I think is pretty cool: the female Soviet soldiers who fought in World War II. Yeah, the Soviet military had multiple women among its ranks, serving as pilots, snipers, and even tank drivers. In the 1940s. I don't know about you, but I think that's incredible. Also, let me just get this out of the way. I am not a Putin apologist, nor am I a tanky. I admire the resilience and creativity of the Russian people, not the horrible things their government is doing right now. And I can assure you that, unlike that other Mercury, I am not a communist. Got it? Okay. Anyways, back to Soda Popinski. For a series that has had so few games, is currently going through a content dry spell that makes Mega Man's look mild, and whose most well-known entry was a vehicle for a now-disgraced celebrity, Punch-Out has managed to, fittingly enough, punch above its weight in terms of pop cultural relevance. Heck, Family Guy has referenced it not once.
Dear Lord, please give me the cheat codes for Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. I have been stuck on Bald Bull for 4 years.
Not twice.
Now, do you ever play old school Nintendo?
Nope.
Well, then what we're about to do may seem strange, but just go with it.
Not thrice.
I'm playing a really cool new video game, Michael Douglas's Munch-Out.
But 4 times.
We use the sound effects from Nintendo Punch-Out.
Body blow, body blow, body blow, uppercut.
And while Soda isn't the most iconic of the foe's Little Mac faces, that title would probably go to either Glass Joe or, if he counts Mike Tyson, he's still surprisingly popular compared to his colleagues. He's even the namesake of a bar in San Francisco. So I thought it would be fun and informative to make a video essay about Soda Popinski, because just like the substance he was named after, he is absolutely overflowing with things to talk about. Итак, без лишних слов, начнем. Let's start this video by just listing some basic info about Soda Popinski. You know, stuff that you could glean by reading his Punch-Out wiki page. Soda Popinski has appeared in 3 of the 5 Punch-Out games, and also features as a trophy in Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and a spirit in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. Though, to be fair, a Nintendo character appearing as a spirit in Smash Ultimate is such a low bar to clear that it almost feels like it isn't worth mentioning. I mean, even my beloved Booze Jellyfish managed to do it. Speaking of booze, it's a well-known fun fact within the Punch-Out fandom that when he was introduced in the 1984 arcade game Super Punch-Out, his name was not Soda Popinski, but Vodka Drunkenski. This is, of course, in reference to vodka, an alcoholic beverage that is commonly produced and consumed in Eastern Europe, especially Russia. It's great for making cocktails. However, in the 1987 NES game and most iconic installment of the franchise, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, his name was changed to Soda Popinski, and the reasons why deserve their own segment, so I'll talk about that later. Like all the other characters from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, sans Mike Tyson / Mr. Dream, Soda Popinski came back for Punch-Out Wii, and was fully voiced for the first time. Unlike most other games with an international cast of characters, Punch-Out Wii's characters don't all just speak the language the game is in, but with accents. Rather, they all speak their native language, regardless of which language the game is set to. In fact, if you're learning a language, Punch-Out Wii can be a good tool to gauge just how fluent you are. Trust me, I took Spanish class as an elective for 3 years, and I vividly remember fighting Don Flamenco in Punch-Out Wii when I was like 15, and realizing just how many of his lines I understood. As a result, Soda Popinski's lines are all in Russian. His voice actor, Ihor Mota, is actually Ukrainian but speaks Russian fluently, which is actually quite common for older Ukrainians, as back during Soviet times, all the schools in the non-Russia parts of the USSR had to teach Russian in addition to the local language. According to his in-game data, Soda Popinski is 35 years old, has a win-loss ratio of 33-2, and hails from Moscow, which is the capital, largest city, and most famous city in Russia. It's the place where St. Basil's Cathedral, the Kremlin, and Lenin's corpse are all located. He is the tallest Punch-Out boxer at 6'6" or 198 centimeters, and he weighs 237 pounds or 108 kilograms. He is also left-handed, and is the only fighter in both Mike Tyson's Punch-Out and Punch-Out Wii to use a left-handed stance. Soda Popinski is usually a late-game boss, and his fighting style mainly consists of hooks and uppercuts. While his fighting style is fairly standard in the NES version, the Wii version gives him a whole new technique. He can pull a Whitney's Mill Tank and drink to regain health mid-fight. He can even do this during between-round taunts, making him the only Punch-Out character whose between-round taunts affect the round that follows them. The Wii version also gives him a signature move, the Soda Fury, a series of uppercuts that he does upon either getting star-punched, getting up from a knockdown, or getting his soda bottle punched out of his hand. Punch-Out Wii also introduces Title Defense mode, in which every fighter Little Mac has faced comes back stronger, faster, and smarter to try to claim the championship for themselves. The Title Defense fights can be divided into 3 categories: the ones who just get more difficult to beat, the ones who cover up their Achilles' heels, and the weird ones. Title Defense Soda Popinski falls into the weird category. Apparently, a group of scientists created a special type of soda that improves one's physical capabilities, and they got Soda Popinski to be their guinea pig. So in Title Defense, instead of drinking regular soda, Popinski drinks this scientifically formulated soda, and it boosts his stats in addition to healing him. However, it makes him more vulnerable every time you dodge one of his attacks. Now, ever since Bumbles McFumbles made his video on who the biggest cheater in Punch-Out is, it's been very common for people on the internet to parrot his claim that Title Defense Soda Popinski is doping. However, I disagree with this interpretation. While the fighters in Contender mode were mostly doing things that are possible and plausible in real life, with the exception of Great Tiger, Title Defense takes a turn for the unrealistic. In this mode, we see Piston Hondo running faster than a bullet train, Mr. Sandman breaking down a building with his bare hands, and Bear Hugger bringing a tamed squirrel who he taught to box into the ring. Do you know how hard it is to train a squirrel to do anything? They're extremely disobedient animals. It would be pretty much impossible for any human being to train a squirrel to play a sport in real life. So, when you take the more fantastical and exaggerated tone of Title Defense mode into account, Popinski's special soda is more akin to a magic potion, and Popinski being able to pull a truck with his teeth after drinking it is consistent with the exaggerated feats of speed and strength shown in this mode. Also, even if you make the argument that a performance-enhancing drug was just the closest real-life equivalent to a stat-boosting power-up that Bumbles McFumbles could think of, I would argue that it's closer to an energy drink. It's a beverage that gives its user a temporary, remember the boosts in strength and speed reset every time you fight him, increase in energy levels, which can be safely consumed multiple times in one day. That sounds way closer to G Fuel than anabolic steroids if you ask me. I think the only reason people equate this power-up pop with a PED is because, unfortunately, it fits the Russian stereotype. One noteworthy thing about Soda Popinski is that he laughs at you when he knocks you down. While in the Wii game this doesn't seem too special, as Bear Hugger, Great Tiger, and Mr. Sandman all do it too, and Aaron Ryan takes it a step further by making zingers when you're knocked down.
You posted your cheeseburgers in those gloves, have you, McFuck?
In the NES game, this was something that only Soda Popinski did, even if the laugh was just recycled from Zelda 2. And while we're on the topic of things being recycled, it should be noted that in the early days of Punch-Out, many of the fighters would have a palette swap somewhere in the roster, a character with a similar body type and usually fashion sense. In the early days, Soda Popinski was a palette swap of Super Macho Man, hence why they put him in a Speedo. Super Macho Man has a lore reason to wear a Speedo. His design is based on bodybuilders who often wear very little clothing, but Soda doesn't, really, especially when you consider that Zangief and his very similar outfit didn't exist yet. Fortunately, by the 2000s, enough Russians had internet access that we in the West learned some of them like to go out into the freezing cold in their swimsuits for fun. So by Punch-Out Wii, it just added to him being a stereotypical Russian guy. Oh, and speaking of which, let's discuss how well Soda Popinski represents his home country. With the exceptions of the protagonists and intimidating final boss characters, every Punch-Out character is designed to reflect a certain country or geographical region and the stereotypes associated with it. These stereotypes can range from, wait, where is he from again? To, how did they even get away with that? But most of them fall into the realm of old jokes you've probably heard a million times before if you're from there. For example, Bear Hugger is from Canada and is a lumberjack and fisherman who lives in the woods, is friends with grizzly bears, drinks maple syrup right out of the jug, says and
Hoser!
multiple times, loves hockey, and is the most affable character in the game. I'm honestly surprised that they didn't have him say sorry about that at any point. Punch-Out Wii tried to soften the blow of these stereotypes by adding in more actual elements from their cultures instead of only drawing from jokes. For example, one of the challenges in the Great Tiger fight is to beat him only using right punches, as in traditional Indian culture, the left hand is only used for bathroom-related activities, so it's considered really gross to touch someone with your left hand. And, as I mentioned before, every character speaks the language that is spoken in their home country, and some even use regionally specific slang. So with that said, how well does Soda Popinski represent his home country of Russia? Let's take a closer look. First of all, let's look at his name. Soda Popinski is mostly just a pun on the term soda pop, but the insky part was added to make it sound more Slavic. In real life, many Russian surnames end with ski, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, Trotsky. From what I've gathered, in Russian and many other Slavic languages, the ski suffix is used to turn something into an adjective, kind of like ish or ik in English. For example, the Russian word for hero is gyroi, and the word for heroic is giroisky. Because surnames originated as descriptors for the people they belong to, many surnames are derived from adjectives in the language they come from, hence why we see so many ski surnames in Russia and other Slavic countries. However, the spelling SKI is actually more common in Polish surnames, as Russian names ending in ski are usually spelled with a Y when using the Latin alphabet. But when you consider Punch-Out as first and foremost a Nintendo game, and that SKI surnames and SKY surnames are both transliterated as Suki in Japanese, it's probably just a translation slip-up on the part of the Japanese developers when romanizing his name. Old Nintendo games weren't exactly known for their top-notch translations anyways. Next, let's look at his appearance. The common perception of Russian men, especially those who are 30 or older, is that they are large, either vertically, horizontally, or both, bald or going bald, and often with some kind of facial hair. And Soda Popinski does hit a lot of these points. He's the tallest boxer in the WVBA, he's even more bald than Bald Bull, and he has a mustache. So he certainly looks like what most people imagine a Russian guy looks like. He even has prominent cheekbones, which are common amongst those of Russian descent. Staying on the topic of his appearance, let's talk about his fashion sense. Most of Soda Popinski's outfits are variants of the same palette-swapped from Super Macho Man outfit that he's had since 1984, but in his Contender Mode intro cutscene in Punch-Out Wii, we see him wearing his normal boxing outfit with two distinctly Russian articles of clothing, a long red coat with maroon fur trim, and a maroon Ushanka hat. That's the style of hat I'm wearing, by the way. The Ushanka was invented in Russia and has been a go-to winter hat over there for many years, especially during Soviet times. And fur coats have been commonly worn in Russia since ancient times, as animal hide is very good at retaining heat, and Russia is an extremely cold country. Furthermore, every single outfit of his contains some shade of red, which is in reference to the color red's prominence and significance in the iconography of the Soviet Union. Red had already been a color associated with revolution and social change since the late 18th century, but because the Russian Revolution was one of the most dramatic, radical, and successful revolutions of all time, the color red, which had been used by the Bolsheviks due to its revolutionary connotations, became heavily associated with the Soviet Union and their political ideals. The Soviet Union referred to their army as the Red Army, and their flag was almost entirely red in color. So people outside of the Soviet Union started referring to them as the Reds, and referred to the increasing anxiety over their geopolitical influence as the Red Scare. And the Russian affinity for the color red goes further than the Soviet Union used red. As in Russian culture, red has long been considered the most beautiful color of all. In fact, the Russian word for red actually comes from an old Slavic word for beautiful, and contrary to popular belief, Red Square in Moscow isn't called that because it's where communist stuff happened, but rather because the buildings there are so pretty. So Soda Popinski wearing red is not only a Cold War era stereotype, it has actual ties to Russian culture. Staying on the topic of his clothes, you'll notice that he isn't wearing very much of them. Doc Lewis comments on this during your fight with him, mentioning that the stadium they're fighting in is very cold and wondering how Soda Popinski is able to wear so little in such temperatures. Furthermore, in his Contender Mode intro, we see him walking around outside on a snowy day with no shirt and nothing covering his legs. Now, it's a common stereotype that Russians are so acclimatized to the cold that they can go out in freezing temperatures wearing whatever, but most Russians will tell you that this is just a myth and they're only able to tolerate the cold because they wear a lot of layers. But there are exceptions to every rule, and in fact, many Russian people believe deliberate cold exposure is good for one's immune system and builds physical and mental strength, a belief that's been around since pagan times. One such practitioner of deliberate cold exposure was Ivan Pavlov, a name that might ring a bell for some people. So maybe Soda Popinski deliberately underdresses for the weather because he thinks it'll make him healthier. Moving on, Russia has given us some awesome music, from traditional tunes to classical compositions to hard-hitting hard bass. And Soda Popinski does reflect this. In Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, some of the fighters have a few bars of music that play before you fight them, usually a public domain tune associated with their homeland. The music that plays before you fight Soda Popinski in this game is from a Russian folk tune called the Song of the Volga Boatman. Punch-Out Wii kept most of these intro snippets, albeit rearranged, and for those that didn't have intro themes, they came up with new ones. In addition, they gave each character a battle theme that plays when fighting them in exhibition mode, which is essentially just the Punch-Out theme arranged into a genre that fits them or their home country. Glass Joe's is French folk music, Von Kaiser's is classical, Disco Kids is, well, disco, and so on. The genre they chose for Soda Popinski is choral music. This is in reference to the Alexandrov Ensemble, also known as the Red Army Choir, the official choir of the Russian military. Known for their stirring performances of folk tunes, national anthems, and hymns, the Red Army Choir is quite possibly the most famous choir in the world. You've probably heard their rendition of the Soviet anthem before. So, the music associated with Soda Popinski is very Russian indeed. Speaking of music, let's talk about what people do when they hear music. Dance. Russians are well known for being very skilled dancers, with some of the finest ballet companies in the world being located there. So, can Soda Popinski dance? Yes, he can. This specific kind of dance is called the hopak, and it's a folk dance from southwestern Russia and Ukraine. You may know it as the Kazatsky kick from Team Fortress 2, or that dance that Zangief does with Mikhail Gorbachev in Street Fighter 2. It's a lot more difficult than it looks, and you need some serious lower body strength in order to do it. So if Soda Popinski is able to do that, he must never skip leg day. Another talent Soda Popinski seems to have is juggling. In title defense mode, if you lose to him, he'll celebrate by juggling 3 soda bottles. Funnily enough, this is also a thing that Russia is well known for, as Russian circus performers are some of the best in the world, excelling at things like contortion, trapeze arts, and, yes, juggling. So whether Next Level Games was aware of this or not, it's still very apt for a Russian stereotype to have this skill. And while we're on the topic of title defense mode, his title defense intro cutscene shows him in a chemistry lab. And I can tell it's specifically a chemistry lab because of all the beakers and flasks on the table and the compounds and chemical symbols written on the blackboard. See? Carbon dioxide. And Russia has made great contributions to the field of chemistry. You know the periodic table? That chart that's in every high school science class and where you can find my namesake in Group 12, Period 6? Well, it was invented in 1869 by a Russian chemist named Dmitry Mendeleev. Other discoveries and inventions made by Russian chemists include ruthenium, formaldehyde, graphene, chromatography, glucose syrup, firefighting foam, BPA, and even saccharin, the first artificial sweetener. Maybe these scientists put that same sweetener into the special drink they formulated for Soda Popinski. Speaking of his soda, when he pulls out a bottle of soda to drink it, he says, This translates to "for my health" or "to my health." Now, I am not fluent in Russian, but I'm pretty sure this is a joke that only works in Russian. See, in Russia, when people make a toast, they say "Ваше здоровье," which means "to your health." In fact, in the NES game, Soda Popinski mentions "drinking to your health" in one of his mid-round quotes, which may be a reference to this. With this in mind, what Soda is doing is toasting to himself. The joke aspect of this remark is that when he drinks his soda, it refills his health bar. It's literally for his health. So he's not just saying what is effectively cheers, he's describing what it does in-game. Clever use of double meaning there. And finally, have you noticed that Soda Popinski seems to brush off pain and discomfort and carry on as if nothing happened? Like, when most of the other boxers get up after a knockdown, they're clearly groggy, but when Soda Popinski gets up after a knockdown, he jumps right back up on his feet in an instant and unleashes his signature move at full force. Also, he's the only character who can heal, and as I mentioned before, he's shown to be highly resistant to cold temperatures. And wouldn't you know it, Russian culture tends to value resilience and tenacity. The Russians are very proud of their ability to keep on keeping on no matter how much life batters them down. That's one of the reasons why they refer to the Eastern Front of World War II as the Great Patriotic War and have huge parades to commemorate it every year. The Soviet Union suffered heavy losses during World War II, with a third of all the war's casualties coming from them alone. But they powered through and came out not only victorious over the Germans, but as one of the biggest superpowers in the world. So Popinski's ability to get up and come back for more is not only a great quality for a boxer to have, it's a great quality for a Russian to have. But I know there's one Russian stereotype that Soda Popinski is famous, or rather, infamous for embodying. A certain pink elephant in the room that I'm sure you're all dying for me to address at this point. So let's talk about the Vodka drunkenski thing. Did you know Soda Popinski used to be Vodka drunkenski? Is one of those video game fun facts that has been circulated so much on so many websites that it has ceased to become fun. It's like, did you know Super Mario Bros. 2 is a reskin of a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic? Like, if you're in gaming circles, you've probably heard it like 70 times before, but everyone who tells you this fun fact still treats it like it's going to blow your mind and shatter your worldview. But when the TV trope for the drunk Russian stereotype takes its name from Soda Popinski's former name, it's basically become required knowledge for anyone who enters the Punch-Out fandom. This is the Russian stereotype that Soda Popinski embodies the most strongly. The stereotype that all Russians love vodka and are heavy drinkers. This stereotype is one that has a grain of truth to it, at least historically. Drinking is an important part of Russian social life and culture, and has been since the Middle Ages, with vodka being their drink of choice. Russians tend to drink vodka neat and in surprisingly large quantities, including straight out of the bottle in some cases. In fact, their standards for alcohol are so high that up until the 2010s, beer wasn't legally considered an alcoholic drink in Russia because it wasn't strong enough for them. Now, of course, drinking a lot is something that happens in many colder areas of the world because alcohol tricks your body into feeling warm by redirecting blood to the surface of your skin. But another factor as to why Russians drink so much is because they're stressed all the time. Russia has had terrible luck when it comes to its politicians, and when a place is ruled by a corrupt politician, the quality of life in that place tends to decline. Thus, Russian people are often stressed and overwhelmed by their miserable lives, and turn to alcohol because it makes them forget about their problems. Now, you're probably wondering to yourself, why would Nintendo, squeaky clean, E-for-everyone games you can play with your grandma Nintendo, include an explicit reference to alcohol in one of their games? Well, first of all, if you're surprised that Nintendo games can reference alcohol, then you clearly haven't done that quest in Breath of the Wild where you have to go to a bar in Gerudo Town and get ice for the bartender so she can make drinks that she explicitly says Link looks too young for. And second, the arcade Super Punch-Out, from which Vodka drunkenski originates, was made in 1984, before Nintendo had developed their squeaky clean reputation. You see, back in the arcade days, the only reason why games didn't have much explicit content was primarily because of graphical limitations, rather than any sort of social pressure to think of the children. And alcohol being referenced in an arcade game was nothing new back then. Only 7 months prior to Super Punch-Out, the game Tapper was released, which was explicitly about a bartender serving Budweiser beer to patrons. And Nintendo wasn't seen as particularly squeaky clean, just as another video game company. But while arcade games were doing okay in 1984, console gaming was still reeling from the video game crash of 1983. In the early 80s, companies like Atari didn't really have any sort of quality control, so anyone with the money and equipment to do so could make an Atari game and sell it. Naturally, this led to a lot of terrible Atari games. Furthermore, home consoles couldn't do nearly as much as arcade machines could, so ports of arcade games on home consoles were always much, much worse than their arcade counterparts. These two factors, combined with an abysmal video game adaptation of the movie E.T. made by Atari in 1982, caused people to lose trust in Atari and home consoles in general, especially in North America. As a result, home video game revenues in the USA fell by a staggering 97%. However, in the land of the rising sun, 1983 saw the dawn of a new console, the Famicom. Created by Nintendo, the Famicom had a rough first year due to hardware issues, but by 1984, those issues had been fixed and it was skyrocketing in popularity. Nintendo was also implementing quality control for their console's games to ensure that it would have a good reputation. So, naturally, they wanted to expand the Famicom to other countries, starting with what was, at the time, Japan's biggest trading partner, the United States. However, when they looked at how video game consoles were doing over there, well...
Oh my gods! The American home console market is ruined! But what if I were to give the Famicom some wacky peripherals and disguise it as a toy? Oh, delightfully devilish, Nintendo.
So yeah, the NES was initially marketed not as an electronic, but as a children's toy. How did they do this? Well, first of all, they refused to call it a console or a computer. They called it an entertainment system and officially referred to the cartridges as game packs. Second, they came up with two video game peripherals that resembled typical children's toys, Rob the Robot and the NES Zapper, which were marketed just as much as the console was. And third, and most importantly for our purposes, they ensured that nothing that could be considered offensive or inappropriate for children would end up on an NES game. Even ports of pre-existing games were scrubbed clean. Maniac Mansion, for instance, had all its instances of swearing, suggestive dialogue, nudity, and even the word kill removed in order for it to be ported to the NES. From its very inception, Punch-Out has been a series that was designed to appeal to Americans. So, when creating the game that would become Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Nintendo had to specifically make it in such a way that it would appeal to American tastes. This included being cognizant of the whole all NES games must be kid-friendly thing. So, they couldn't just put Vodka drunkenski into the game as is. But instead of axing him altogether, they decided to just change his name and favorite beverage to soda. Believe it or not, this wasn't the first time that a video game changed alcohol to soda to make the game more kid-friendly. Remember Tapper? Well, shortly after its release, they realized that maybe a game about serving beer might not go over well outside of bars, where the game was intended to be installed. So they made a rethemed version specifically for arcades called Root Beer Tapper, where you served root beer to customers instead of actual beer. However, in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Soda Popinski was still a drunk Russian stereotype, albeit one that was so subtle that you wouldn't get it unless you already knew about said stereotype. I mean, he has a pinkish skin tone, which could be evocative of an alcohol flush reaction. And that's not even taking into account his between-round quotes. One is completely innocent, two use the verb drink without specifying what he is drinking, one uses an uncommon term for feeling woozy after being punched in the face that just so happens to contain the word drunk, and one reveals that Soda Popinski can't drive. Now, funnily enough, when you consider the year that Mike Tyson's Punch-Out came out and is set in, and the city and country that Soda Popinski comes from, him being unable to drive is not unusual. The process of getting a car in the Soviet Union during the 80s was extremely long and tedious, and Moscow has an expansive subway system that's been around since 1935, so there would be less of a need for Soda Popinski to own a car anyways because he could just take the subway. But I'm pretty sure the people who came up with this line wouldn't have known that, so in more likelihood it's a joke about how it's illegal to drive while drunk. When Punch-Out Wii brought back Soda Popinski, they very wisely decided to do away with the whole drunk Russian thing, but tack on a bunch of other Russian stereotypes to him to make up for it. So he's a dancing, Ushanka-wearing Ruski with an incredible resistance to cold weather, but it's unambiguously clear that what he's drinking is, in fact, soda. It looks like soda, it sounds like soda, it fizzes like soda, and the bottles that it comes in are clearly made of plastic, judging by how Soda Popinski is able to crush one without it shattering. As I mentioned in my Nihiligo video, liquor is almost always served in glass bottles, not plastic. Plastic bottles are used for non-alcoholic drinks, like water, fruit juice, and yes, soda. However, they still snuck in one little remnant of Vodka drunkenski. hidden behind a language barrier. Apparently, Soda Popinski's speech has a bit of a drunken slur to it, though it's only noticeable if you already speak Russian. It's unknown whether this was thrown in by Ihor Mota or whether the voice director specifically told him to sound a little drunk. It seems that every time Soda Popinski shows up in a game, they play down the drunkard aspect of his character, but tack on other Russian aspects and stereotypes to him. Going off of this trajectory, I bet that when and if Nintendo makes another Punch-Out game, we'll see Soda Popinski literally take a breathalyzer test on screen to prove that he hasn't been drinking any alcohol whatsoever, but we'll also learn that he has a wife that's way more attractive than him, his hobbies include doing ballet and playing Tetris, and his coach is the Baba Yaga, and his intro cutscene will have him riding into the ring on a troika while wearing an Adidas tracksuit. Now, if I may get personal for a bit, I used to be a bitter Betty about how Soda Popinski loves booze had become a common fanon joke. I was insistent that he just really liked soda, and hated when people reduced his personality to lol drunkard. I think it had something to do with the fact that I was a teenager and a goody two-shoes, so I didn't have any first-hand experience with alcohol and assumed it was a purely negative thing that tears people's lives apart, like what my health classes said. However, after turning 21 and being able to buy my own booze, I discovered that I actually loved it. Don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware of the dangers of alcohol, I only drink in moderation, and I've had moments where I've regretted getting as drunk as I did, but still, getting drunk, or at least tipsy, is just fun for me. You see, I'm autistic, so I've always had difficulty in social situations. But for some reason, when I'm drunk, I'm far more social and more willing to start conversations with others. I'm also very much a happy drunk, often laughing at everything around me and being affectionate towards my loved ones. So, as drinking became more common for me at social gatherings, I began to make self-deprecating jokes about my own love of alcohol, as is common for many American women, and that extended to making jokes about drunkenness in general. And it was then that all the Soda Popinski loves booze jokes finally became hilarious to me. But the reason I made this video is because I wanted to show the gaming community that he was more than just a drunk. Fittingly for a Russian guy, he's like a Matryoshka doll. There's a lot more to him than what's on the surface. And hold on to your big furry hats because I'm about to drop a Tsar-Bama of a revelation. Soda actually was very popular in the Soviet Union. Yeah, you heard me. A Russian guy being obsessed with soda isn't just an odd cover-up for the drunk Russian stereotype. It actually has some historical precedent. For example, did you know that one of the greatest military generals in Russian history loved soda as much as Soda Popinski does? Georgy Zhukov was the deputy commander of Soviet forces during World War II, and oversaw many decisive battles in said war, including the famous Battle of Berlin. He had such a great track record when it came to winning battles that he became known as the Marshal of Victory. After the Axis powers had been defeated, Zhukov met up with future US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had led the Allied powers in Western Europe. Eisenhower introduced him to an American beverage known as Coca-Cola, and Zhukov thought it was delicious. In fact, it tickled his taste buds so much that he wanted to take some back home with him. However, there was one problem with that: Joseph Stalin. He already didn't like Zhukov and was envious of Zhukov's popularity, so if he discovered that Zhukov enjoyed drinking an American beverage during a time when anti-Americanism was ramping up in the USSR, not only would Zhukov's reputation be ruined, but Stalin would probably use this as an excuse to, do Stalin things to him. So Zhukov reached out to Mark W. Clark, an American general stationed in Austria, and asked if it was possible for the Coca-Cola company to make a special version of Coca-Cola that tasted the same, but came in generic packaging and was clear like vodka. He passed the request on to then-President Harry Truman, who passed it on to Coca-Cola itself. Coca-Cola was happy to fulfill his request, making a colorless and generically packaged version of Coca-Cola called White Coke specifically for him. 50 crates of white Coke were sent to Zhukov, who was very happy with them. He drank white Coke regularly from then on, and because the drink looked like vodka, nobody knew he was drinking Coca-Cola. They just assumed he was a heavy drinker, which is quite common for military veterans, especially back then when they couldn't just go see a therapist. So while to a casual observer he just looked like another vodka drunkenski, in reality, he was quite possibly the very first soda Popinski. And it's not just Zhukov. During the 60s and 70s, the Soviet Union started making their own fizzy sodas for their people to drink. Russian YouTuber NFKRZ has a YouTube short where he talks about these sodas, which I will link below. These sodas included a pear-flavored soda named Duchesse, bright green Tarkhun, which is made with a plant called tarragon, and Baikal, the Soviets' answer to Coca-Cola, which was flavored with Siberian ginseng, black tea extract, cardamom, lemon oil, and eucalyptus oil. Baikal even became the official drink of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. But none of these can compare to the impact that Pepsi had on the Soviet Union. In 1959, the Soviets held an exhibition in New York City to show off their technology, and the Americans reciprocated by holding an exhibition in Moscow to show off their technology. It was at this American exhibition that Richard Nixon, the US's vice president at the time, got into a heated debate with Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union. PepsiCo executive Donald Kendall managed to quell their argument by offering Khrushchev some Pepsi. Khrushchev took a sip and thought it tasted good, and more Russians became curious about this exotic treat. So once Kendall became CEO of PepsiCo, his goal was to spread Pepsi to the Soviet Union. And in 1972, Pepsi struck a deal with the Soviet Union and became the first American product sold in the USSR. Because Soviet law prohibited using the Soviet ruble abroad, they paid for Pepsi by exchanging it with something from their country. You can probably guess what it was. By the late 1980s, Russians were drinking about 1 billion servings of Pepsi a year. In fact, in 1989, demand for Pepsi was so high that vodka alone wasn't enough to pay for it. So the Soviet Union sold 5 old ships and 17 old submarines as Pepsi payment, which were converted to scrap metal. That's right, they sold naval ships to Pepsi to get more soda. That's how desperate they were to satiate their sweet tooth. With that in mind, it's no wonder why Soda Popinski loves his soda so much. Regardless of whether we're going off of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out's time frame or Punch-Out Wee's, Pepsi was probably his first taste of the world beyond the Iron Curtain. In conclusion, Soda Popinski is one of the most fascinating Punch-Out characters, and deserves to be remembered as more than just a did-you-know gaming tidbit. And to all the people at Nintendo and Next Level Games who brought Soda Popinski to life, I raise you this glass of Pepsi, spiked with just a hint of vodka. Vaše zdrowie! And if I hear one more person claim that he's doping, I swear to God, I'm going to take a deep breath and realize there are much more important things in the world than bad fanon interpretations of characters I like. Like, what might happen if footage of me in this outfit falls into the wrong hands? Anyways, if you liked the video, or just impressed by the fact that I made a video about something other than Pokemon or Mega Man, be sure to like and subscribe. And make sure to support my Patreon if you can. Until next time, stay stylish.